And now I'd like to welcome here on TVP World Daniel Szeligowski, head of the Eastern European program here at the Polish Institute for International Affairs. We're at the Strategic Arc Conference. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, when we look at the war in Ukraine, of course, we've seen that the country's had a very difficult time lately. We've seen a big delay in aid packages going to the country, ammunition shortages and what have you. We've also seen Europe scramble to provide more aid to Ukraine. Do you believe at this point that the political leadership across NATO countries has made the decision what exactly it wants in Ukraine, whether it wants Ukraine to be victorious?
Well, I would say that still the lowest common denominator is not to let Ukraine fall. I think this is something that most, or essentially all of the leaders agree upon. But whether we are discussing Ukrainian victory or Russian defeat, I'm a bit skeptical now, whether there is really a consensus among the partners, Ukraine's partners, and the broader international coalition to defeat Putin. I would rather say that most of these people fear the Russian defeat more than the Ukrainian defeat. So it's still helping Ukraine, but to an extent which would not undermine the internal situation in Russia. I have my own problems with that, of course.
Okay, right. Please clarify. How could it be possible that Western leaders could fear a Russian defeat more than a Ukrainian defeat?
So, of course, they fear potential consequences of the fall of the Putin's regime. Surely the priority is always keeping in mind that there's a lot of nuclear weapons in Russia and that it could fall into the hands of the people whom we don't know. Essentially, this approach is based on the principle that the devil whom we know is still better than the devil whom we don't know yet. And you can always see different comments coming from our Western partners that someone who comes after Putin could be even worse. The problem that I get with it is that essentially unless Russia is defeated, and it is defeated, I would say there are two components of the potential Russian defeat. The first one is Russia must be defeated decisively, not just to a small extent. And the second component is Putin himself must acknowledge that he's been defeated. That's essentially important because it's moral component. Putin still thinks he can outweigh us. We're telling them as long as it takes, but basically the Russian response is, okay, we will fight as long as it takes and one day longer, we can wait. So this moral component telling clearly the Russians, you won't get it, you will lose whole Ukraine. This moral component is absolutely clear. And now, of course, there is this fear of the Russian defeat, but I think it runs even deeper. So it runs to the very DNA of the Western civilization and the transatlantic alliance. Essentially, European politics is based on a win-win approach. So we're always trying to come up with a cooperative outcome. Someone wins a bit more, someone wins a bit less, but essentially no one loses. That's the problem. I mean, the theme of this year's strategic arc is art of winning. The art of winning is we win and someone has to lose. In that kind of approach, Russia must lose. But there is no consensus yet that Russia should lose decisively.
So, in your opinion, what is the outlook for this year for Ukraine? Obviously, this war is going to drag on for quite some time. Do you see a scenario where either negotiations might take place if Ukraine would lose even more ground than it currently has?
Well, the Ukrainian troops are on defensive now. This is obviously a consequence of our indecisiveness. So I'm not gonna put on a brave face and say that the mistakes we made these 2 years they have had no impact on the Ukrainian capabilities. Surely they had. So now we have Ukrainian army on the defensive, and I would say if we end up in December 24th with more or less the same front line, I would call it a success, given the circumstances in which we are now. But again, I totally agree that the war will drag on. Putin switched the Russian economy to war footing, and he is already prepared for a longer war. Still have doubts about the Europeans, a bit less about the Americans, but essentially the problem is in Europe with building a strong defense industry. So given that fact, I don't clearly see any options for negotiations. It takes two to tango, but it takes just one to start a war. And Putin, he's the one who started this war. If he thinks that he can win this war, if not this year, but next year or in 2 years' time, there's absolutely no point for him to negotiate, unless he thinks that through negotiations, he would get even better outcome. So that's the problem. I mean, the moment we enter negotiations with the Russians, likely the international community that supports Ukraine would crumble. And for Putin himself, even if he knows more or less that the negotiations would go nowhere, that will be an instrument actually to sow divisions within this coalition. So, someone used to say, of course, that the war is politics by other means. And from the Russian perspective, negotiations is war by other means.
How much capacity do you think Europe has left to continue to fund weapons transfers and aid for Ukraine? Has it reached its limit, or?
In terms of hardware, we are reaching limits. So this is important that in the short-term perspective, the U.S. stays on board and delivers the weapons to Ukraine. In the midterm, we would be able to catch up, but the decisions have not been made yet in terms of expanding the production lines in Europe, building new factories, etc. So business won't go into production without the long-term commitment from the governments, which is not there yet. Yeah? In terms of money, that's not a problem. I mean, even from the U.S. perspective, $60 billion is just peanuts. I mean, this is nothing. And Ukraine is spending like 5% of the U.S. military budget. This is absolutely nothing. This is the rounding error in the U.S. budget. The same goes with Europe. Like 50 billion euros, the assistance package coming from the European Union. This is absolutely nothing. So money is not the problem. Now the problem is the lack of political will and the lack of, the shortages in terms of hardware that we would send to Ukraine. This is something that we would struggle with in the short term.
And, assuming that the United States continues to provide military assistance, if it doesn't, then what does Europe do at that point?
Well, that's a good point, because we have two options. I mean, the first one, logical one, would be that we catch up with the shortages and try to make up for the U.S. withdrawal or U.S. sitting behind. The second option is the negative one, the potential one that this unity within Europe would crumble without the U.S. leadership. So I think both are possible, and the first one is really optimal from our perspective. The second one, not necessarily. So this is important that the U.S. stays on board, not necessarily in terms of being on the front line politically, but that there is U.S. leadership somewhere behind, that there is American hardware, that there is American political wave from behind, especially those allies who are still hesitant. And it's absolutely important because the deterrence it works in the eyes of your adversary. Adversaries, we know who adversary is, Russia. If there is only European unity behind Ukraine, the European coalition, without the U.S., clearly on board, I would say this is absolutely not credible from the Russian perspective.
Now, concerning the elections in the United States coming up, I think we've witnessed European leaders somewhat scrambling to kind of cover their bases in the eventual situation that, say, former President Donald Trump wins the elections. What is your view of what the political leadership across NATO countries right now is doing in anticipation for the upcoming elections?
In a positive scenario, this is Europe doing more to show Trump that we are serious, and then some decisions are irreversible. That's important even to show it to Putin that these decisions are irreversible. But my worries are that this is actually a lot of discussions and a lot of talking, but very little substance. So there are worries that Trump would come and the assistance coming from the U.S. and the U.S. presence in Europe would diminish. But then, if this is serious and if the worries are quite serious, where are the decisions in Europe? to invest in defense capabilities, again, to expand the production lines, to increase assistance for Ukraine. I mean, none of this is happening at the moment. So what is Trump proving apart from discussions?
Do you think that there'll be less, if Biden perhaps wins the elections, then European leaders would be less serious about bolstering defenses here on the continent?
My worries lie elsewhere, so not necessarily with the U.S. leadership at this moment. I think that the very negative stimulus would come actually from any potential talks between Ukraine and Russia or the West and Russia. And several Western leaders would interpret it as this is largely the end of the war, so there is no point in investing in defense capabilities. Like, that's the end of the story. Now we are getting back to the business as usual, or even if this is not business as usual, it's still business. So we can focus on social spending, we can focus on our internal matters, politics, etc. So this is something that I am worried about. I know there are different Western leaders trying to gently push Ukraine for the talks with Russia. I don't see it materializing. I mean, the substance is not there, which means that there is absolutely no willingness, no appetite on the Russian side to get, I mean, to get that kind of deal and to make concessions towards Ukraine, which means that ultimately these negotiations would only be to the favor of Russia.
If we look at basically the Russian demands in negotiations and Ukrainian demands in negotiations, they are worlds apart. In your opinion, do you think the two can ever find a way to marry up their demands?
I don't really see it coming. The first point is because largely we tend to think about the negotiations within the paradigm of land for peace framework, which is absolutely not the case, because the war is not about territory. This is the war about Ukrainian statehood. So I'm always telling that Putin is a dog in the manger. He thinks he will get Ukraine. If not, he will destroy it. So it's absolutely not about territory. It doesn't matter for Putin whether he controls 10%, 15, 20% of the Ukrainian territory. This is about future statehood, future of Ukraine and Ukrainian nation as such. So you can't really compromise in this respect. I mean, you can still be victorious without a victory. So you would be able to create a functional, successful Ukrainian state on the territory which is under control of the Ukrainian government, without this 20, 15, 10%. But that's just one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is it is nothing that satisfies Putin. If it's not about territory, he will get 20%, rearm, re-equip, and strike back.
Could you see a scenario where Ukraine says goodbye to its eastern lands and falls under a NATO umbrella?
This would again require two to tango, so and a consensus within NATO to accept Ukraine, which just does not control fully its territory. And on the other hand, Ukraine, which I don't see Ukraine telling its population that we are making territorial concessions towards Russia. I mean, that's the end of the story.
Right.
No, temporarily, it's telling to the population that we cannot have it now because we have no capacities, we have to wait. And this is a temporary solution. Yes, I could imagine that kind of situation, but my problem would be with getting the consensus within the alliance. Now, if there is a precedent, of course there is, and it is Western Germany. But could you, at the moment, generate this consensus within the alliance? That's probably the biggest problem now.
Yeah, certainly that would be very difficult. Well, Daniel Szeligowski, head of the Eastern European Program and the Polish Institute of International Affairs, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Today.